anybody not get, it's kind of confusing because we had a twofer. Kyle was super prepared, and so he had his stuff ready for Wednesday in addition to today's handout was passed out. This previous Wednesday, there we go. Does anybody need any material? Is what I'm trying to say. Today's lesson is lesson 5, part 4, Jesus the Christ, historical evidences. And then next time around is lesson 6, part 1, salvation, God's plan. Does anybody need either one of those?
Part 1.
6, part 1? Here you go. Anybody else?
Okay, what was the last one?
The one for Wednesday is lesson 6, part 1, salvation, God's plan. Yep, you got it. Yep. Anybody else? Everybody good? Going once, going twice? All right. Sold. All right. So now I'm going to get these mixed up. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get going here. Let's see here. We are going to continue studying our essential doctrines, and today we are focusing on Jesus the Christ. This is the 5th part, 6th part. I've lost track of which part we're on here, but we've talked about Jesus the Christ for a while, which I thought was appropriate to spend some time talking about our Savior. So again, hopefully these lessons continue to do justice here. Our lesson objectives for this particular one, we've got analyze the mythicist, which is hard to say, arguments for the non-existence of Jesus, and then examine the biblical and secular evidences for Jesus' historicity, another fun word there. And then finally, we're going to try to debunk some of the common theories meant to undermine Jesus' existence and his resurrection. I hope that sentence makes sense there. Let's go ahead and talk about our foundational assumptions here. And these are just things that we kind of agree upon going into a Bible study that are kind of important here to make sure that we kind of agree upon. First one being the Bible is inspired and is the source of truth. Secondly, God has revealed all that we need to know in the Bible. Third, what one believes matters to be acceptable to God. Fourth, some doctrines are essential and are the basis for unity. Fifth, it's possible to determine the truth on essential doctrines. Sixth, what one believes will be expressed in behavior. And then finally, we may disagree on unessential things. And some things just can't be known. So these are, again, some foundational assumptions and things that we hopefully agree upon going into each of our Bible studies that we can, again, hopefully kind of be eye to eye on. Before we begin, I haven't asked anybody in advance. Kyle, would you mind leading us in prayer at this time?
Heavenly Father, Lord, we're so very thankful for the time that we have together here this morning to study from your word. And Lord, we are thankful that you have given us truth and given us a means by which to know what you have established as truth. I pray that you'll be with us as we look over not only your word, but what we can learn from things that have been recorded historically to help grow our faith, but also to help others to come to a knowledgeable faith as well. Lord, I pray that you'll be with Jonathan and help him to have a good memory of the things that he's prepared, and be with the rest of us, and help us to listen and to file these things away that we might be able to use them to help others come to know you. We love you, God, and we ask all this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
All right, so we're going to talk about mythicism, the mythicist arguments here. And this is a growing contingent of people who not only deny that Jesus is the Son of God, which we kind of expect going in talking to a secular audience, agnostic, atheist type audience here. We'll take it a step further with the mythicist argument and just say that Jesus as a man just never even existed as a historical figure. So this was actually a dominant view in the Soviet Union, which may not be surprising there with some of the movements they've had over there. It's gained traction in the West among skeptics on the internet. So as we have all this, these different articles and those kind of things appear, some of which you see on the board here. Did Jesus exist? Is Jesus a myth? Questioning the historicity of Jesus. Saw several of these articles in the process of preparing this lesson. So here are some of the mythicist arguments that we might encounter and what they kind of use as the basis for their beliefs or lack of beliefs here in this case in regards to Jesus. First of all being that Jesus is never mentioned in any Roman sources. Next, there's no archaeological evidence. Third, the Gospels came long after Jesus' death. And then a big one here is they were pre-existing god or pagan gods, which were said to die and rise again. Horus and some others will discuss a bit later on. Thus, Jesus' supposed godhood and resurrection in that legend is merely a Jewish adaptation of other mythologies that, again, were precursors to what they look at as being the Jesus myth here. And so, long story short, too late, the mythicists dismiss the existence of Jesus, and they kind of liken that Jesus story to a tradition built onto a legend. And they look at it as no different than what we see when we look at Robin Hood or King Arthur or other figures that seem to have a history of going along with their legend there. So we're just going to approach each of these arguments for the first part of this lesson, going just kind of systematically through those and kind of analyzing those and see if there's anything to those as we approach each one. So the first one we're going to look at is the Roman sources. And contrary to the mythicist argument, we see that there actually are allusions to Christ in Roman times. This is just a sampling. There's more than this that I found. I've got an article down here that I've kind of drawn some information from. And there's more than what we're going to look at here this morning, but here's just kind of a sampling of some of the different ones you can see. We've got a lot of fun words to pronounce here, so just bear with me. We got Pliny, which is the governor of Bithynia, wrote the Roman Emperor Trajan in AD 112, asking for advice on how he should deal with Christians who have made a practice to meet on an appointed day and sing a hymn to Christ as if to God. Again, we're looking at a secular audience here talking about the Christians and those kind of things during that time. The Roman historian Tacitus, which is one we're going to talk about quite a bit, off and on, kind of make reference to him in his Annals, AD 115, referred to Christus, not sure how we pronounce that, who was executed at the hands of the procurator Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. And then also we've got Suetonius, I guess I'm pronouncing that correctly, a popular Roman writer who declared that Claudius expelled Jews from Rome because they were continually making disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus. And Chrestus, looking at that term there, that's going to refer to Christ, but it's a corrupted form of that name. When I say a corrupted form from my source, I couldn't understand if that was a mistranslation, that they came to understand related to Christ, or it was a detrimental term that they're using to kind of look down on Jesus there. I'm not sure. But this is actually kind of interesting because Luke actually alluded to the situation that was being written about here in Acts 18 and verse 2. So anyway, some biblical, connection there that we see connected to those writings of Suetonius here. Now going to archaeological evidence, unfortunately we do have to admit that mythicists are correct in saying that there's no archaeological evidence for Jesus. However, when you look at Jesus as a man here, that's to be expected if you think about it. Given Jesus' status as where he was in the society of that time, a poor itinerant teacher in the Galilee region who died a criminal's death. So why would there be a lot of archaeological evidence tied to Jesus? And we'll talk more about that as we kind of go through, because this one comes up again in a later slide. But here's a quote that's pretty interesting and kind of notable here from a professor of religious studies, Bart D. Ehrman. The reality is we don't have archaeological records for virtually anyone who lived Jesus' time and place, and again, consider Jesus' station or role in society, again, as a man there, as being this poor person, and compared to someone like, say, Caesar, and these philosophers and those kind of things that we would encounter in this time period. So while we don't have archaeological evidence for Jesus directly tied to him, we do have a lot of archaeological evidence that kind of proves some things that we would see in the Bible, in particular the New Testament, that kind of lends some credence to Jesus here. So I want to examine just a couple of these, because once again I found a lot of these, and I just try to find some pretty interesting ones that I thought we could throw in here to our archaeological evidence slide. So we got modern archaeologists just kind of scouring the Bible lands, making discoveries that would be linked to the life of Jesus. These continue to be made just as we go on, just time and time again. I think we made reference to one of these when we were doing our historical evidences for Scripture. How can we trust the Bible? There's always new things being discovered. Well, it sounds weird to say new things being discovered, old things being discovered that were just kind of forgotten, right? And so it's interesting that time and time again, the Bible is proven more and more accurate by these archaeological discoveries that are made, and rediscovering things that were already established in Scripture, and we could put our trust in that. So one of these that was kind of neat was these many ruins of different synagogues. And why in the world would that be notable? It corroborates the accounts of Matthew and Luke, because there are these scholars that suggest that the synagogue, that whole system didn't exist until after the destruction of the temple in AD 70, and that would therefore discredit Matthew and Luke's account of Jesus going about preaching in the synagogues. We reference that in Matthew 4:23 and Luke 4:16. But the remains of synagogues dating prior to AD 70 have been unearthed in Capernaum and several other locations throughout the Galilee region, which again would corroborate with what we would read in those two gospel accounts there. All right, going on. Another one, whoops, yeah, there we go, there it pops up there. It scared me, it disappeared, and it popped up. It was meant to do that. The first century pool of Siloam, the location at which Jesus healed the blind man, had been discovered as well. You can see that pictured there in the image there. And just like so many of these discoveries that happen, it's just kind of wild to me that they just built over top of these old things, right? They just discover these ancient ruins, those kind of things, just the strangest ways. But this one was actually discovered in 2004 during repairs to a drainage system, of all things. And so you can see they've uncovered it there in that image, which is, again, kind of neat. Continuing on to another one here, we have the Holy Lands just kind of being overrun, from what I understand, with different tourist trap type locales claiming to be actual historical sites. But here we have an ancient well at Mount Gerizim, where Jesus met the Samaritan woman, you might recall, in John chapter 4. But this one is unanimously recognized by Jewish, Samaritan, Christian, and Muslim traditions, and agreed upon by modern scholars to actually be the Jacob's well we read of in Scripture. So that one's pretty neat as also. But to me, this one might be the most intriguing, and this is called the Nazareth inscription. And this is a first century imperial edict pronouncing the death penalty for anyone caught stealing bodies from tombs. And this is apparently directed toward a Jewish audience based on what's inscribed there. It calls to mind that Scripture, what Scripture records concerning the Jewish leaders spreading the lie that the disciples had stolen Jesus' body, we read in Matthew 28. And so the context of this Nazareth inscription clearly proves it was written for Jews and not Gentiles, and almost certainly issued by Claudius in response to this story that was circulated about the resurrection of one Jesus of Nazareth, that King of the Jews. This is historian Dr. Clyde Billington that made that commentary there. So again, no direct archaeological evidence, but again, that would be expected with Jesus' status in that time period. So we do have some things that do tie to his life and can kind of confirm things that we've seen in New Testament scriptures. So it's worth bringing that up as well if we were to encounter someone that would question the existence of Jesus based on archaeological evidence. Continuing on, something we've talked about before is New Testament evidences. So this is going to be a lot of repeat information, but it's worth talking about once again. Because if you remember, the mythicist argument was that we just can't trust these New Testament evidences. They came so long after the life of Jesus that we just can't count those. But as we previously discussed, the Gospels and the New Testament documents, they can be regarded as factual primary sources. There's a lot of emphasis put on primary sources when it comes to historicity. Am I saying that word correctly? I keep saying that word. Historicity of different documents and those kind of things. We're studying at school right now in social studies class. This is a primary source because it was written by George Washington himself, and so we can trust that. So the same thing with the New Testament. These were written by eyewitnesses who walked with Jesus. The time gap is something that will come up, and something that I think is rightfully brought up is that there's a time gap between the events that actually took place and when they were recorded. But compared to other ancient documents, it's significantly short. And just looking up here at the board, you can see, I'm not going to go through all of those, but the author of different ancient manuscripts compared to the date they were written, compared to the earliest copy, the approximate time span between the original copies, and down at the bottom you can see highlighted the New Testament's written in the 1st century AD, between the years 50 to 100. The earliest copy would be in AD 130. That's less than 100 years compared to some of the other documents we see up there. Plus, the number of copies is significant as well by comparison. So, these other ancient documents, we look at those, or a historian would look at those, and from their perspective, they're above scholarly approach. We're just not going to deal with those. Those are going to be things that we're not going to question. Whereas we look at the New Testament, particularly the Gospels, they're often under unfair scrutiny, I think, by comparison. There are bold claims made by the New Testament, of course. There's these miraculous events and those kind of things. There's a supernatural, bias, or a bias against the supernatural that would be in there. And so it's just the nature of the document that's being called into question. but compared to other documents, compared to that same standard, you can see it's kind of an unfair scrutiny that's being applied to it. And so again, I kind of already made this point. Scholars will generally dismiss the Gospels due to their incredible claims. The writings of Paul, however, are highly regarded as primary sources, verified to have been written in the first century by Paul himself. And I didn't put this up here, but I just recall the detail and reading one of those articles talked about. That's what a lot of people think. That's where the Jesus myth originated, was from Paul, and that it was him that started the Christian religion more than anybody else. Again, from this mythicist standpoint, which again kind of feeds into the next point, talking about Jesus' resurrection and just Jesus himself. Is he a plagiarized pagan myth? And what we mean by that is, these skeptics have noticed some parallels between Jesus' resurrection and these pagan deities such as the Egyptian gods Osiris and Horus, along with the Greek gods Attis and Adonis. And I think I'm mainly focused on the Egyptian ones here, but let's talk about and approach this here, because there would be some similarities, at least from an outside standpoint looking in. We can trust that Jesus' resurrection accounts not plagiarize pagan myth for the following reasons. The first one being that the accounts of Jesus' resurrection, the Gospels, they are historically eyewitness accounts. When we look at a pagan myth or any myth, they're called and considered myths because they lack any kind of evidence, right? And so we already have these Gospels, which, as we looked at in the previous slides, those are trustworthy. Those are things that we can trust as eyewitness accounts, as primary sources. And these other pagan myths that we encounter, such as Osiris and the others, they don't have that. They have a tradition of those kind of things, but that's about it. Another thing that's kind of interesting that connects to Scripture is that pagans such as the Greeks, they generally didn't believe in resurrection. And think about the Athenians in Acts 17, who had mocked Paul for his preaching concerning Christ's resurrection. They kind of made fun of him for that, right? And that was something they kind of ridiculed him for. And then any supposed parallels that do exist between these accounts of the resurrected Christ and these stories of these dying and rising pagan deities, they're all false. So they're all really weak comparisons. There's no reason to think that the early Christians would have borrowed from the Egyptian stories to apply to Jesus. For example, the Egyptian god Osiris, in the legend, never rose from the dead. He died and became this ruler of the underworld, which is very different from Jesus being resurrected and what he would do there. I think that we would notice that. Likewise, the Egyptian god Horus didn't die after being stung by a scorpion in the story. So he's stung by a scorpion, he dies, he's revived by magic, so he didn't die. He, to quote Monty Python and Holy Grail, he got better, right? So he didn't die there in this case. But anyway, I can't remember which one was which here. Is Horus the one that's got the eagle head there? And then Osiris, I think, might be the one that's sitting on the throne there. But those are part of a Egyptian trinity. Again, another loose parallel there that we would see to the Bible there, that they would claim that that's evidence that this is all made up and all hokum here. But Christians, again, had no need to borrow the concept of resurrection from paganism, because the idea of resurrection was something they already believed in based upon Judaism. Unlike those pagans of the same era, first century Jews believed in resurrection. Of course, the Sadducees being a notable exception to that, we can read about in Acts 23:8. Recall that Martha, when she assured Jesus of her belief that her brother Lazarus would rise again in the resurrection of the last day in John 11:24. And so again, this shouldn't be surprising considering the Jewish prophets prior to the first century foretold the resurrection of Jesus, Isaiah and Daniel and other places as well. So this is something that we can look at and kind of, I guess, throw back some scrutiny in this case, that this thought that he's a plagiarized pagan myth, Jesus is, that we can say no, and kind of punch some holes in that idea. Yes, sir.
And another thing, along with this idea of it being pagan, a lot of times you'll hear the argument that the myth of Jesus is just like all the other myths of Hercules and others. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in how God brought this about, that he brought Jesus through the Jews, which was fulfilling a promise to Abraham, but also was bringing Jesus into a nation that did not have a concept of God being born and walking in the flesh.
Yeah.
That is completely foreign to anything they would have understood. And so the concept that the Jews had, this myth of a God becoming flesh, that was
It's the very reason why Jesus almost couldn't be accepted amongst his own people, is because this goes against everything we believe to be possible. So the argument that this is just pagan origins, well, going back to the fact that it comes from the Jews really kind of answers that. They would not have thought to think this way. This went against their very being.
Yeah, very good. Any other thoughts before we continue on? I think we've approached each of the mythicist beliefs up to this point, but
The prophecies that were made in the Old Testament were misinterpreted by the Jews at that time.
Yeah.
Because they thought that the Messiah was going to be an earthly ruler. And they didn't realize until it was looking back at the prophecies that what the prophecies were really saying. So they didn't tailor-make Christ to be a fulfillment of the prophecy because they misunderstood the prophecy.
exactly. I've always likened the Jewish idea of what the Messiah is going to be to an Arthurian legend. You know, King Arthur type figure or a King David like figure. It's going to come back and again be a military leader and those kind of things on the proverbial white horse and all that kind of stuff. But that's not what we see, which is interesting because that's what you expect from an earthly perspective is that he would come in on the white horse and just take over and here we'd be, right? Any other thoughts? All right, so let's talk about the historical Jesus. What can we know about Jesus, again, from a secular perspective here? So we can learn quite a bit from Tacitus and Josephus, two famous historians who were not Christian. And I thought I was going to have a whole slide dedicated to this, but I do not think I went back and did that. So why do you think it's notable to have sources from around the time of Christ who weren't Christian? Like, what value is that as an evidence?
Unbiased.
Yeah, they're not going to have any kind of bias. And actually, wasn't Tacitus kind of hostile toward Christians? And Josephus, of course, being a Jew, would have disagreed with everything. Was he a Pharisee, or did I misunderstand that, Josephus? Or was he tied to that in some way? All right, well, I thought I read that, but I could have been incorrect on that, just confused with other things. A lot of reading was going on, so we'll continue on to talk about things that we do have on the slide here. So almost all these following statements made about Jesus, which are asserted in the New Testament, they're corroborated and confirmed by relevant passages in Tacitus and Josephus. These independent historical sources, again, one a non-Christian Roman and the other a Jew, they confirm what we're told in the Gospels. So the first one being that he was reported to have been born of a poor virgin and that his father was a carpenter. And that's, again, a detail we see mentioned in Scripture, of course, pretty notably. And here it is confirmed by these outside sources. He was a teacher, and his disciples passed on his teachings to others. He prophesied and performed miracles. Others might say he might have done these amazing healings and those kind of things, but regardless, we see this mentioned in a secular source. He was known for his wisdom and his virtuous wife. He claimed to be God, and that's one that I've heard also that kind of besides the mythicist argument that people try to question Jesus is that, well, he never said he was God. But we see that in Scripture that this was the case, and here we have it from a secular source acknowledging this as well. He was crucified by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar in Judea. And again, despite not having archaeological alleged evidence tied to Jesus specifically, we do have those historical figures, Pontius Pilate and Tiberius Caesar, crucifixion going on during this time, and Pontius Pilate been involved in these executions of that time period. So again, notable things happening here. Number 7, there was an earthquake and darkness accompanied his death. So as Jesus was on the cross, there was records of an earthquake occurring and darkness happening. And I looked this up to see if this was like, it'd be really neat to tie this to a solar eclipse or something, that there was a solar eclipse that happened during this time. But I think based on what I read is that this would have been the new moon phase, which is quite the opposite of the full moon phase we'd expect to encounter a solar eclipse. And so this was a supernatural darkness that we have evidence for in a secular source here, that there was something that made the world really dark, or that day really dark in this area, accompanied with an earthquake, which again goes back to scriptural accounts. Number 8, his followers reported that he had risen from the dead, appeared to them, and showed them the wounds in his hands. Number 9, his followers worshiped him as God. And then finally, belief in Jesus caused disturbances within the Jewish hierarchy, which led to Claudius's decree for the Jews to leave Rome. Additional statements, some of these are kind of silly, but they're worth noting because these are things that people would question in this mythicist mindset. He existed as a man. His first name was Jesus. He was called Christos in Greek. He had a brother named James. He traveled in the Galilee region, healing and teaching. He won over both Jews and Greeks, what we call the Gentiles of the Hellenistic culture, and Jewish leaders of the day expressed unfavorable opinions about him. His execution was specifically by crucifixion. So, putting all these statements together, it seems like we have a pretty good idea of who Jesus was, again, at least from a secular historical perspective here. This quote here is by Marcus Borg, professor of religion and culture at Oregon State University, and I found just a whole page of just quotes, just talking about the same kind of idea here. He wrote, "Some judgments are so probable as to be certain. For example, Jesus really existed, really was crucified, just as Julius Caesar really existed and was assassinated. We can know, in fact, as much about Jesus as we can about any figure in the ancient world." Again, notable based on Jesus' station, again, in the secular human sense here, as we'll see in the next slide. Any thoughts, any comments on the historical Jesus before we continue on?
Just on Josephus, this says that he was born into a priestly family, so he would have been a Sadducee, but that he apparently studied the teachings of Sadducees, Pharisees, and the Essenes, and not liking any of them, he wound up becoming a Pharisee, likely just to help his standing,
Gotcha.
which I think goes probably to his idea of being a history writer.
Yeah.
He was a questioner,
Yeah.
looking at things.
It still confirms many of the facts that we know about Jesus from the outside perspective, which is, again, that's interesting. Any other thoughts before we continue on?
Going back to number 7 and the mentioning of the darkness there accompanied by his death, I studied once, and I probably am only going to say enough to get myself in trouble here, but I distinctly remember this. I studied once where just as the rotation of the Earth, Moon, and Sun can be predicted in the future, they can also go backward and predict how it rotated. And there is a period of time there in which it stood still that they can't explain.
Wow. Okay, I'll look into that. That's really neat. Because I looked up, I thought, well, that'd be really neat because, like you said, they can do that. I mean, that's how they navigate by the stars.
I can remember studying
that.
It's been several years ago.
Yeah. But again, it's notable, like you said, that we don't have a natural explanation for it, and yet it's recorded in history. So that's really interesting. Any other thoughts before we continue on? All right, so this is a claim that Christians will make a lot of times regarding Jesus versus Tiberius Caesar as far as historical evidences go. But I think it's really interesting to bring up and really notable to bring up in these situations. We have some tiny text, so I'm going to do my best to read it. And if you want a copy of the slideshow, that's great. I'll give that to you. It used to be even smaller, but I copied and pasted stuff into my notes. And so I just got really carried away with this because I thought it was really neat. So, as the Roman Emperor Tiberius, obviously, have been one of the most powerful men alive during the life and ministry of Christ as he existed on earth. And so, there's going to be coins that have been found, but the name of Tiberius' reign, that's, again, to be expected. The primary way we know about him is through written accounts. Now, this is interesting. Some appeared long after his death. I should have brought my magnifying glass, because if you guys are having trouble reading it, I can't read on my little note slide here. So the story of his reign is known from 4 sources: the Annals of Tacitus and the biography of Suetonius, written some 80 or 90 years later on. The brief contemporary record of Velius of Paterculus, of the 3rd century is Cassius Dio. These disagree amongst themselves in the wildest possible fashion, both in major matters of political action or motive, and in specific details of minor events. But this does not prevent belief that the material of Tacitus can be used to write as a history of Tiberius. This is A.N. Sherwin-White wrote this. There are a few other sources mentioned by White. Interestingly enough, and ironically enough, there's biblical sources that aren't mentioned here inside of here that would point to Tiberius being an actual historical figure. Most scholars believe that we have sufficient documentation for his life based on these accounts that don't agree with each other, that are far removed from his life as it would have been. But we're going to be satisfied with this as a scholar here of history. That's enough, they'll say. Now, switch to Jesus. Unlike Tiberius, Jesus had no political position, no military power, no government authority. Again, as far as the world is concerned, he was an itinerant preacher who was largely rejected by his own people. His public ministry was just 2 to 3 years long, and he only traveled within Judea. And yet, we have 4 historical biographies in the Gospels, which we've talked about quite a bit, written in the first century when they still would have been eyewitnesses around to either confirm or reject the claims. So again, compare that to the evidence we have for Tiberius here. Additionally, we have the letters of Paul. 7 are accepted by critical scholars. We kind of may mention this earlier, which date from 20 to 30 years after Jesus' death. There's also these things that the secular scholars would call creeds embedded within Paul's letters, such as 1 Corinthians 15, which likely date within 5 years of Jesus' death. And we also have the other New Testament books as well. The early church fathers, we talked about some of the writings of those guys previously, and secular sources such as Mara, Bars, Serapion, Josephus, Tacitus, remember those guys, Suetonius, and so on. So a lot of historicity that can be given to Jesus from these outside sources compared to this Tiberius Caesar guy who would have been very important. And that's what this next quote kind of sums up here. Tiberius was the most powerful man in the world of his day. Jesus was one of the poorest, belonging to the peasant class as a Jewish carpenter. He even died the most shameful death, a slave's death on a cross during Tiberius' reign. Yet we have far more reliable written sources and closer to the time of Jesus' actual life and death than this Caesar of Rome. And that's Justin Bass from The Bedrock of Christianity. So I thought this was pretty neat because I'd always heard that claim that there's more evidence for Jesus than there is for this particular Caesar. And it was kind of neat to look at that and examine that a bit further. Any thoughts on that? Because I thought that was just a really, really interesting, really amazing thing to read about. Kind of speaks for itself, doesn't it? So let's continue on. So we already talked about some of the evidences for the resurrection, but I thought we'd go a little bit deeper with a few of those. Some of these we're revisiting, and some of these are things that I did include. Kyle expressed some concern whenever I showed him the notes for that lesson that you're just kind of shooting yourself in the foot, man. You're not going to have much to talk about when you get to the historical part. So we've got some more information here about the resurrection and evidences for that, because that would certainly feed into, again, this historicity that we're examining of Jesus. And so I wanted to approach at least the first couple of these as a debunking of some popular theories that are out there. And there are more theories, but we're looking at mainly 2 here for our purpose, for our study. And the first one being the stolen body theory, the idea that, well, Jesus' body wasn't in the tomb because, a bunch of his followers just stole the body and that was it. And that's why we don't have a body in the tomb here. If you remember, the Pharisees feared the body of Jesus would be stolen. However, the disciples wouldn't have motivation for stealing the body of Jesus. Additionally, the Pharisees took precautions to prevent Jesus' body from being stolen in Matthew 27:62 through 65. In this account, we can read this tomb was sealed shut. And correct me if I'm wrong, this is how the tomb was sealed, correct? They had almost like an outer lip that would come out from the tomb. We had the stone rolled in place, so it almost makes like a lock type situation where it can't be pulled down from the front. Again, you have to roll it back into that little lip there in order to get it out, and so on and so forth. Was there other precautions they would have took as far as sealing a tomb goes?
They guarded it.
Yeah, they did have guards. Yeah, they had guards there. But as far as sealing the tomb, was there anything else? Yes.
I once heard, and I don't know about, because I don't know anything about the weight of that.
Yeah, I was going to say the weight, yeah.
There was once I read about the weight of that stone, and the first people to arrive were these women, and it took men several to be able to move that.
Yeah, that's a good point. We're going to get to the testimony of the women here in just a bit, but that's a great point. The weight of the stone, I meant to look it up and I failed to do that. But yeah, it was mentioned that we have these Roman soldiers here. Maybe you can't read that super tiny writing there. We got a division of 4 to 12. Again, depend on the account of what you will look at and accept there. Roman soldiers would have been guard the entrance. And again, that's based on military protocol of the day. So what would they have sent as a guard contingent to guard this tomb and those kind of things. Again, anywhere from 4 to 12, we're kind of speculating as to what it would be. But again, even 4, I mean, that's again pretty substantial amount of soldiers there that are guarding the tomb. Also consider that anyone attempting to steal the body of Jesus, they would have had to bypass and circumvent thousands of Jews who would have been camping in the surrounding area as part of their pilgrimage to Jerusalem during this Passover. It would have been pretty obvious to see someone break into a tomb and stealing a body and getting out of there. It's highly unlikely that a group of disciples could have done this without being seen or heard by someone, and they would have eagerly reported them to the Jewish or Roman authorities, I think, because this is something that was well aware that this is something that Jesus predicted, right? Ironically, the Jewish authorities affirmed that the tomb was empty because they planned to tell people that Jesus' followers had come in the night and stole his body. Read Matthew 28:13. This is kind of an interesting note that I never really thought about this. Consider that the burial places of famous people were often venerated. I guess that still continues today in the ancient world, and yet for Jesus Christ, arguably the most famous person in all of human history, no grave nor tomb it was ever said to have contained his body. And we have, again, going back to the idea of the Holy Lands having all these places that purport or claim to, this is the site where this happened, this is the site where this happened, without any kind of evidence. There's not a tomb for Jesus, and again, we would have known that we would have been venerated in that time period, and that tradition would have continued on today, and yet we don't see that. Any other thoughts on the stolen body theory before we go on? All right, we'll continue on. Another one that you may have heard of is the post-resurrection mass hallucination. I thought it kind of rhymed, or it seemed like it was going to rhyme. I guess resurrection and hallucination don't rhyme. I was really excited about that. And then I said it out loud, I was like, that doesn't really rhyme. So we've got this mass hallucination theory that everybody just imagine this and those kind of things. And it would be really easy to refute the story of Jesus' resurrection if no one ever saw him again after he had died. But we do have documentation that people not only saw the resurrected Jesus, but also touched him, they walked with him, they ate with him, and again had conversations with him in the Gospels. And that's pretty tangible. You know, you don't talk to, well, I mean, maybe you do, maybe you talk to hallucination, but you don't touch an hallucination, you don't eat with hallucination, and those kind of things as well. We have the account in 1 Corinthians 15:6 that states the resurrection of Jesus was seen by over 500 brethren at once. And psychologists, modern psychologists, confirmed that this could not have been a case of mass hallucination. And just for giggles, I looked up, are there cases of mass hallucination? And I found these different resources that talk about mass hysteria, that this is mass panic, that something happens, and everybody's freaking out, and those kind of things. I think in our modern era, people are kind of familiar with the Mandela effect, where you think you remember something after the fact, and that's kind of interesting, but I couldn't find anything about mass hallucination. And so I don't know where this idea was even came up with to begin with, the idea that all these people they just thought they saw Jesus, and we can just ignore that then. Yes, sir.
And even with the Mandela effect, there are like small, or there's very big things that you might remember the same as me about that. A movie that never existed, but we remember the actor that was in it.
Yes.
But being able to tell intricate details of that movie,
Yes.
we can't do that. We can't come up and have your story, my story, Meredith's story, Freda's story, all about this movie, and it matches exactly.
Yes.
There's just not a single example of that, even in the Mandela effect, which is the closest thing to this idea of mass hallucination.
Yeah. In a court of law, if we were to go to a court of law and have all these witnesses convinced by eyewitness accounts, again, the question comes up, why would we question the testimony of those who claim to see the resurrected Jesus unless we have this bias against the witnesses? So, again, this talk speaks to the historicity of Jesus, and again, the bias against those New Testament documents and eyewitnesses that would have lived and seen and experienced all these things here. And I guess I didn't have it in there, but again, that tangible part there, I think can't be overlooked. The idea that they were doing activities. They were interacting with Jesus in tangible ways. The idea that, again, you don't touch, walk with, eat with, an hallucination there. This was a physical event here. So it wasn't I can't remember if Kyle talked about this, the spiritual resurrection. That's something that people will throw out there too, is that Jesus was just spiritually resurrected and it was just a hallucination kind of thing. rather than a tangible event here as well. Any other thoughts on mass hallucination post-resurrection? Doesn't rhyme, theory there. Doesn't rhyme. I'm disappointed. All right, here's another one that I guess I really hadn't considered before. Oh, okay. I hadn't really, I can hear it now. The criterion for embarrassment. So maybe you've heard this before. I had not. And so this is a type of historical analysis in which an historical account is deemed true under the inference that the author would not have gone out of their way to create or falsify historical material that would embarrass themselves or weaken a position in arguments with opponents. That's a run-on sentence. But again, think about it. Why would anybody write something, especially if you're going to base a religion on it, that is going to make you look bad? So I was familiar with the concept, but not the name for it. It was a name for it, the criterion for embarrassment. So the Old and New Testament, we're well aware, I believe, as Bible students, are full of examples of biblical quote-unquote heroes being depicted as less than perfect. Consider, and close to our discussion, the cowardly nature of the disciples of Jesus, for example. Looking back at the Old Testament examples of Moses doing things that we would consider very Moses-ly, and so on and so forth. The crucifixion of Jesus is an example of this, an event that meets this criterion, since this method of execution is considered the most shameful and degrading in Roman times. Again, going back to the idea, if we're going to falsify something, like Dad said, we're going to make Jesus the strongest, the biggest, and the most handsome, and all these kind of things, and he died a criminal's death, why would we choose to falsify that information? That's kind of an embarrassing detail. This is something else I've never considered before or thought about. Again, viewing this from a secular world misunderstanding here, John the Baptist baptizing Jesus. From our perspective, Jesus being a higher, being compared to John the Baptist. From the outside looking in, it's like, why was he baptized by John the Baptist? I thought Jesus was supposed to be the best and those kind of things. But again, the irony being that John himself states that in Scripture, in the text, he said, you should be baptizing me, rather than the other way around. So that was another one that was thrown into that criterion of embarrassment, at least again from a secular viewpoint. And this was mentioned already, the testimony of women here. So in John chapter 20, 1-7, we'll read the account of Mary Magdalene discovering the empty tomb, telling what she found to Peter and other disciples who had confirmed that the tomb was indeed empty. And this is notable because the testimony of women, ladies, was considered unreliable during the time of the Romans. If a lady said it, then we're just not going to consider that as factual. That's just a bias they had toward the time. However, the Gospels, whether it's the embarrassing details of different situations or the testimony of women being accepted, they prove reliable and report the truth as it was, despite the embarrassing details or cultural taboos of the day. Real quickly, before we're out of time. The testimony of the early church, contrary to popular theories that Christians invented Jesus' deity and resurrection as legends hundreds of years later, evidence shows the disciples proclaimed his resurrection immediately in Jerusalem, where he was killed, again, where claims could easily have been disputed. I think we've mentioned this part before. This is an interesting one. While many facts from antiquity rest on just one ancient source, or two or three sources, generally render the fact unimpeachable, the proclamation of Jesus' resurrection appears in over 10 independent sources, dating to within 5 to 50 years of Jesus' death. Again, going back to some of those extra-biblical, non-canonical works, but they count as historical evidence, I believe. And this is one we didn't talk about. This is the birth and growth of the church. Acts 2:40-41 records that around 3,000 souls were added on the day of Pentecost. It's interesting to consider that the Christian church wasn't a short-lived cult that faded out after Jesus' death and, again, from a secular perspective, supposed resurrection. The church positively thrived in the first century and beyond. From the beginning, the church brought about a huge instantaneous shift in, I put church on my slide, in the religious, maybe they had shirts, I don't know, the religious landscape of the day. Despite facing intense persecution, the church survived and continues to endure into the modern era. So, to conclude, summary here, Jesus, myth, man, or more. Based on biblical accounts and even secular evidence, we can be confident that the man Jesus of Nazareth existed, so he exists more than just a myth. But we also have evidence that points to the fact that Jesus was more than a myth, more than a man, as evidenced by his resurrection. Man, myth, or more, ultimately what we believe concerning Jesus Christ, that's of eternal consequence. We have evidence for him being a human. We have evidence of him being more than a human. So it's like we see recorded in Matthew chapter 16, 13 through 16. Jesus speaking to his disciples asked the question, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter would rightly reply, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And that's what matters, is what we believe about Jesus. We have these evidences that confirm our belief, but in the end, do we truly believe? Do we truly accept Jesus as our Christ, as our Savior? And that's what we kind of know we want to kind of end on, is that question. Are we living in such a way that, proves our belief in Christ? Thanks everyone for your comments and things there. We'll